I stood there in the CFO's office holding a manila folder that contained enough evidence to destroy 5 careers, including the woman who had spent the last 18 months systematically dismantling mine. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The panic attacks that had plagued me for months had mysteriously vanished. All I felt was a strange calm as I placed the folder on his desk and watched his face transform from mild irritation at the interruption to genuine shock as he flipped through the pages. "Are you absolutely certain about these numbers?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Every single one. I've triple-checked everything." And that's when he said the 6 words that changed everything: "We need to call the FBI immediately." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me rewind 18 months to when I first met Sarah Williams, the woman who would become both my mentor and my tormentor. I was 34 when I joined Meridian Pharmaceuticals as a senior financial analyst. After spending nearly a decade at a smaller company where growth opportunities had stagnated, this felt like my big break. Meridian was expanding rapidly, having just secured FDA approval for a breakthrough arthritis medication. And they were staffing up their finance department to handle the projected revenue surge. My first impression of the office was typical corporate America: sleek glass partitions, ergonomic chairs, and that persistent hum of fluorescent lighting that becomes the soundtrack of your professional life. The team seemed friendly enough during my interviews, and the compensation package was significantly better than what I'd been making. Plus, there was actual room for advancement here. At least, that's what I thought. Sarah was introduced to me as the director of financial operations, my direct supervisor and the person who had championed my hiring. At 42, she had the polished look of someone who belonged in a stock photo for successful executive woman, tailored clothes, strategic highlights in her shoulder-length brown hair, and the kind of confident smile that made you feel both reassured and slightly intimidated. "Mark." She greeted me with unexpected warmth on my first day, clasping my hand in both of hers. "I'm so glad you're finally here. Your resume stood out from the moment I saw it, and I just knew you were exactly what we needed." I'd later learned that Sarah had a gift for making people feel special, singled out, chosen. It was like being bathed in warm light when she focused her attention on you. And for those first few months, I basked in that glow. "You have such a unique perspective," she'd say during our one-on-ones, leaning forward with genuine interest. "Most people just regurgitate what they think I want to hear, but you actually think critically." She began inviting me to higher-level meetings, asking for my input on strategic decisions and mentoring me on the political landscape of the company. I was flattered, of course. Sarah had an impressive track record. She'd been headhunted from a Fortune 500 company 3 years earlier and had already received 2 promotions at Meridian. "You remind me of myself when I was coming up," she told me over lunch one day about 4 months into my tenure. "Smart but underestimated. That's actually an advantage, you know? People don't see you coming." My colleagues noticed the special relationship too. There were the obvious comments, teacher's pet and golden child, but mostly good-natured. What bothered me more were the subtle shifts in how information flowed around me. Conversations would sometimes stop when I approached, or I'd discover I hadn't been copied on certain email threads. "Don't worry about it," Sarah advised when I mentioned it. "Success breeds resentment. Focus on delivering results and I'll handle the politics." And I did deliver. I streamlined our financial reporting processes, identified several areas of cost leakage that had been overlooked, and developed a new forecasting model that reduced our quarterly projection variance by nearly 30%. Sarah made sure my achievements were highlighted in department meetings and gave me glowing reviews. By my 6-month mark, I was on cloud 9. I'd already received a modest raise, unusual for someone so new, and Sarah had begun hinting that she was grooming me for advancement. "The company's creating a deputy director position next fiscal year," she mentioned casually as we were leaving the office one evening. "I think you should apply when it opens up. I'd love to have someone I trust as my right hand." I spent that weekend floating on air, already mentally spending the salary increase and planning how I'd restructure certain processes once I had more authority. My wife Katie, a pediatric nurse who had supported my career move despite the initial uncertainty, was thrilled. "I knew this was the right decision," she said, pouring us both another glass of celebratory wine. "You seem so much more energized about work now." She was right. For the first time in years, I felt intellectually challenged and appreciated. I was sleeping better, hitting the gym more regularly, and generally feeling optimistic about the future. That Monday, Sarah called me into her office first thing. "Close the door," she said, her expression serious. When I sat down, she slid a folder across her desk. "I need your help with something sensitive." Inside was a preliminary audit report for one of our subsidiary companies, Wilson Biotech, which Meridian had acquired 2 years earlier. The numbers didn't look good: significant discrepancies between reported inventory and actual stock, unusual patterns in accounts receivable, and several large transactions with vague documentation. The audit team flagged these issues, Sarah explained, but I think they're overreacting. Wilson operates differently than we do. They're smaller, more entrepreneurial. Their documentation isn't always perfect, but that doesn't mean there's actual wrongdoing. She leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly. The thing is, Mark, if this report goes up the chain as is, it could trigger a full regulatory investigation. That would halt our product launch timeline and tank our stock just when we're trying to secure additional funding. I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders as she continued. I need someone I trust to take another look, someone who understands both the numbers and the bigger strategic picture. She tapped the folder. Can you review this quietly? See if you can reconcile the discrepancies or at least provide context that makes them less concerning. Of course, I agreed immediately. Not only was I flattered by her trust, but the assignment felt important. I was protecting the company from unnecessary disruption while ensuring financial integrity. At least, that's how Sarah framed it. Let's keep this between us for now, she added as I stood to leave. No need to worry the team until we know if there's actually something to worry about. That was the first red flag I should have noticed, the request for secrecy. But I was still seeing everything through the golden haze of Sarah's approval, interpreting her secrecy as a sign of her special trust in me rather than something more sinister. I spent the next 3 weeks digging into Wilson Biotech's finances. The more I looked, the more troubled I became. The discrepancies weren't just sloppy bookkeeping, there were systematic irregularities that suggested intentional manipulation. Inventory that existed on paper but not in reality. Services billed but never delivered. Revenue recognized far earlier than it should have been. When I brought my findings to Sarah, I expected concern, perhaps even alarm. Instead, she seemed oddly unperturbed. These are the kinds of growing pains you see in acquisitions, she said dismissively. Different accounting cultures, systems that don't perfectly align. But Sarah, I pushed back, some of these issues could constitute fraud if they're intentional. The revenue recognition alone, Mark, she interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. I appreciate your thoroughness, but you're missing the forest for the trees. Wilson was a strategic acquisition that's critical to our 5-year plan. The board is watching this closely. We need to handle this delicately. She took the report I prepared and placed it in her drawer. Let me think about how to approach this. In the meantime, I'd appreciate if you'd help Wilson's finance team improve their processes so these issues don't continue. I left her office feeling unsettled but still trusting her judgment. After all, she had been navigating corporate finance at this level much longer than I had. Maybe I really was being too rigid in my interpretation. The following week, Sarah introduced me to Ryan Chin, Wilson's finance director, who would be coming to headquarters for a month of integration activities. Ryan was about my age but with the smooth confidence of someone who had been fast-tracked since graduation. He dressed like he shopped exclusively at Nordstrom, wore designer glasses that probably cost more than my first car, and had a way of making even casual observations sound like profound insights. Mark is one of our rising stars, Sarah told him as we shook hands. He'll be helping streamline some of your reporting processes. Ryan's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Looking forward to it. What followed was a month of subtle resistance and passive-aggressive cooperation. Ryan would agree to implement changes during our meetings only to explain later why they weren't feasible or necessary. He would forget to provide requested documentation or send it in formats that required hours of manual reformatting. You'll have to excuse our methods, he'd say with a smile that bordered on condescending. We're more focused on innovation than paperwork at Wilson. Throughout this frustrating process, Sarah remained supportive in our one-on-ones but strangely ineffective in breaking through the resistance. In group meetings, she would nod sympathetically when I raised concerns but ultimately side with Ryan on most disputed issues. We need to be flexible became her mantra. Different businesses require different approaches. By the end of Ryan's visit, very little had actually changed in Wilson's financial reporting. When I expressed my frustration to Sarah, she patted my arm reassuringly. You've laid important groundwork, Mark. These things take time. Let's give them a quarter to implement the changes they did agree to, then reassess. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what was bothering me. Sarah still seemed to value my work and my regular responsibilities were going well. The promised deputy director position had been officially announced and she continued to encourage me to apply. I tried to push my concerns about Wilson to the back of my mind. That changed abruptly 3 months later when I received an email that wasn't meant for me. It was a Friday afternoon and I was wrapping up for the week when my phone pinged with a new message. The email was from Ryan to Sarah, but I'd been accidentally included, likely because my name had been mentioned in the body of the message. Sarah, as discussed, I've made the adjustments to Q3 projections using Mark's model but with our optimized assumptions. This should give us the numbers you need for the board presentation without raising flags. I've also prepared the alternative version as a backup if questions get too specific. Let me know if you need anything else before Tuesday. Attached were 2 spreadsheets, one labeled board_Q3_projections and another called contingency_detail. I opened them both. The first contained financial projections that were significantly more optimistic than anything our data supported. The second was a more realistic assessment that matched closer to what I would have produced, but with carefully worded explanations for why the lower numbers were unnecessarily conservative and reflected incomplete understanding of Wilson's market position. I sat staring at my screen, a cold feeling spreading through my chest. They were manipulating the numbers and they were using my forecasting model to do it, likely because my model had gained credibility throughout the organization. For a long moment, I considered marching directly to Sarah's office to confront her. But something stopped me, a sudden, instinctive sense of caution. Instead, I forwarded the email to my personal account, then deleted it from my work inbox and emptied the trash. That weekend was one of the worst I'd experienced professionally. I cycled through disbelief, anger, and fear. Was I overreacting? Was this just normal corporate spin that I wasn't used to from my smaller company experience? Or was I witnessing actual fraud? And if it was the latter, what was my obligation? What were the risks to my own career if I raised concerns, or if I didn't? Katie noticed my distraction. Work stuff? She asked as I stared blankly at the TV Saturday night. Yeah, just a complicated situation. I couldn't bring myself to explain it fully yet, not until I understood it better myself. By Monday morning, I had decided on a cautious approach. I would probe gently without revealing what I had seen to gauge Sarah's reaction. If there was an innocent explanation, she would likely share it. If not, well, I'd have to figure out next steps. I knocked on her open door after lunch. Got a minute? She waved me in with a smile. For you? Always. I took a seat and tried to look casual. I've been thinking about the Wilson integration. Have they made any progress on implementing those reporting changes we discussed with Ryan? Sarah's expression remained pleasant, but something flickered briefly in her eyes. Some. They're still adjusting. Why do you ask? I'm just concerned about data integrity for our forecasting models. If their inputs aren't reliable, it could throw off our projections significantly. She nodded slowly. That's a valid concern. Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you about Wilson. The situation there is politically sensitive. Ryan reports directly to Wilson's founder, who still has significant influence with our board. We need to tread carefully. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Between us, I share some of your concerns. But this is a delicate balance between financial best practices and organizational realities. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. She was testing me, seeing if I would accept this corporate doublespeak as justification. I understand, I said, matching her conspiratorial tone. I just want to make sure my work isn't being used to support conclusions that the data doesn't actually justify. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Your models are excellent, Mark. How they're interpreted at the executive level sometimes requires nuance. Trust that I'm looking out for both the company's interests and yours. I left her office with confirmation of what I had feared. Sarah was fully aware of the manipulation and was actively participating in it. What I didn't yet understand was why. What did she gain from this deception? And more importantly, how widespread was it? Over the next few weeks, I began quietly investigating, careful not to arouse suspicion. I looked for patterns in financial reporting discrepancies, particularly around Wilson Biotech, but also in other areas where Sarah had significant influence. I documented everything meticulously but kept the information at home, not trusting the security of my work computer. During this time, Sarah's behavior toward me began to change subtly. Our one-on-ones became shorter and more focused on immediate deliverables rather than strategic discussions. She stopped inviting me to certain meetings I had previously attended. Small criticisms of my work started appearing in emails, nothing major, just enough to create a paper trail of dissatisfaction. The deadline for the deputy director application was approaching, and despite these warning signs, I still submitted my materials. Part of me hoped I was imagining the cooling of our relationship, that Sarah still intended to support my advancement as she had promised. I was wrong. 2 weeks after applications closed, Sarah called me into her office. "Close the door," she said, her expression solemn. I knew what was coming before she spoke. "Mark, I wanted to talk to you personally about the deputy director position." She sighed, managing to look genuinely regretful. "The selection committee has decided to go with another candidate. I fought for you, but honestly, there were concerns about your readiness for a leadership role at this level." I kept my face neutral despite the anger building inside me. "May I ask what specific concerns were raised?" "There were comments about your communication style sometimes being too direct. And some felt your understanding of our business model isn't comprehensive enough yet, particularly regarding our acquired entities like Wilson." The irony was almost laughable. My too direct communication style was code for not being willing to manipulate data, and my supposed lack of understanding about Wilson was actually my unwillingness to participate in what I was increasingly convinced was fraud. "Who got the position?" I asked, though I already had a suspicion. "Ryan Chin will be joining us from Wilson as the new deputy director starting next month. I hope I can count on you to help him transition smoothly." And there it was, the final puzzle piece. Ryan had obviously been promised this promotion, likely as a reward for his creative accounting at Wilson and his willingness to play along with whatever Sarah needed. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm a team player." As I left her office, I noticed an email notification pop up on my phone. It was a company-wide announcement of Ryan's promotion, praising his innovative financial leadership and strategic vision. The message had been sent while I was sitting in Sarah's office. She hadn't even waited for me to process the news before broadcasting it to everyone. That night, I told Katie everything. "You need to go to HR," she said immediately. I shook my head. "It's not that simple. Sarah is well connected throughout the company. HR reports to the chief administrative officer, who plays golf with Sarah every weekend. I'd be labeled a troublemaker and potentially blacklisted in the industry. Then go above HR. The CFO, the board, someone who would take financial manipulation seriously. Without hard evidence, it would be my word against hers. And right now, all I have are suspicions and one misdirected email that I technically shouldn't have kept." Katie looked at me with concern. "So what are you going to do? Just accept what's happening?" "No," I said, my resolve hardening. "I'm going to get proof. Concrete, undeniable evidence that can't be swept under the rug." What followed were some of the most stressful months of my professional life. Ryan took over as deputy director and immediately began reshaping the department. Several team members who had been with Meridian for years were reassigned or encouraged to find opportunities elsewhere. They were replaced with new hires, many of whom had previously worked at Wilson. My role was gradually marginalized. I was excluded from strategic discussions and assigned to increasingly routine analyses that didn't utilize my skills. It was a classic corporate move, make someone's job so tedious and unrewarding that they leave voluntarily. Sarah's interactions with me became purely transactional. The warmth and mentorship that had characterized our early relationship vanished entirely. In meetings, she would often speak over me or dismiss my contributions with a quick, "We've already considered that approach," before moving on. It was demoralizing, and there were days when I seriously considered resigning. The stress was affecting my sleep, my mood, even my relationship with Katie. I had started grinding my teeth at night and developed chronic tension headaches, but I didn't quit. Partly out of stubbornness, partly out of a sense of justice, but mostly because I was still gathering evidence. And what I was finding was far worse than I had initially suspected. The financial manipulation wasn't limited to Wilson Biotech. Sarah and her allies had created a sophisticated system of misleading accounting practices across multiple divisions. They were inflating revenue, concealing costs, and presenting growth projections that had no basis in reality. The deception had apparently been going on for years, predating even Sarah's arrival at Meridian. I became obsessive about documentation, creating secure backup copies of everything I discovered. I worked late most nights, using the empty office to access systems without drawing attention. I even befriended an IT manager who, for the price of occasional help with his fantasy football statistical analysis, provided me with access logs that showed who had modified certain critical files and when. The turning point came about 4 months after Ryan's promotion. Meridian announced a major new partnership with a European pharmaceutical distributor, a deal that would supposedly generate over $200 million in new revenue over 5 years. The stock jumped 12% on the news, but as I reviewed the underlying financial models for this partnership, I noticed something strange. The projected revenue assumed sales volumes that exceeded the production capacity we had disclosed in regulatory filings. Either we had secret production facilities that weren't being reported or the numbers were fictional. I discreetly contacted a colleague in operations who owed me a favor. Just curious, I asked casually over coffee, have there been any capacity expansions I haven't heard about for the arthritis medication? He looked surprised. No, we're already at max capacity at both facilities. There's been talk of building a third plant, but nothing's been approved yet. That was the final confirmation I needed. The European partnership projections were fabricated, designed to inflate the stock price artificially. This wasn't just aggressive accounting anymore, it was securities fraud. I spent the next week compiling everything I had discovered into a comprehensive report. Charts, spreadsheets, email trails, system logs, before and after comparisons of manipulated reports. I organized it all meticulously, creating a narrative that even someone without financial expertise could follow. On a Thursday morning, I requested a meeting with the CFO, not through Sarah but directly through his executive assistant, citing an urgent compliance matter. To my surprise, he agreed to see me that afternoon, which brings me back to where the story began, standing in the CFO's office, watching his face as he reviewed my evidence. Michael Grayson was not what I had expected. At 62, he was nearing retirement and had the reputation of being somewhat disengaged from day-to-day operations. Many considered him a figurehead who let his directors run their departments with minimal oversight, which would explain how Sarah had gotten away with so much for so long. But the man who looked up at me after 20 minutes of silently reviewing my report was not disengaged. His eyes were sharp with anger, his jaw set. "How long have you been gathering this information?" he asked. "About 6 months, sir." "And you're certain about these numbers? These discrepancies are intentional, not mistakes." "Yes, sir. I've triple-checked everything." He nodded slowly, then reached for his phone. "We need to call the FBI immediately." I felt a momentary panic. "The FBI? Not internal audit or the board first?" "Son," he said gravely, "what you've uncovered here isn't just a policy violation. It's criminal fraud. Securities fraud, wire fraud, potentially mail fraud depending on how certain documents were transmitted. As officers of a publicly traded company, we have a legal obligation to report this to the authorities." He must have seen the fear on my face because his expression softened slightly. "You did the right thing bringing this to me. I know that couldn't have been easy, especially given your position relative to the people involved." What happened next unfolded with surprising speed. The FBI arrived within hours. The company's general counsel was called in. Sarah, Ryan, and 3 other executives were escorted from the building. By the end of the day, their company accounts frozen and devices confiscated. The CFO personally walked me to a secure conference room where I spent the next 8 hours being interviewed by FBI agents and SEC investigators. I provided them with copies of all my evidence and walked them through the most complex aspects of the fraud. By midnight, I was exhausted but strangely exhilarated. For months, I had been carrying this secret burden, doubting myself at times, wondering if I was overreacting or misinterpreting what I was seeing. Now, watching federal agents treat my concerns with deadly seriousness, I finally felt validated. The company announced an internal investigation the next day. Trading of Meridian stock was temporarily halted. When it resumed a week later, the price had dropped nearly 40%. The press coverage was brutal, with headlines like "Pharmaceutical Giant Faces Fraud Investigation" and "Meridian Executives Accused of Massive Financial Deception." I was placed on paid administrative leave during the investigation, standard procedure, I was told, not a punishment. For 3 weeks, I stayed home, answering occasional questions from investigators but otherwise trying to decompress from the ordeal. Katie was my rock through all of it. "I'm proud of you," she said repeatedly. "No matter how this turns out, you did the right thing." I wasn't so sure. While I believed in the rightness of exposing the fraud, I wasn't naive about the potential consequences for my career. Whistleblowers, even when vindicated, often find themselves labeled as troublemakers or disloyal. I had potentially made myself unemployable in my industry. Then came the call from Michael Grayson asking me to come to his office. I arrived to find not just the CFO but also the CEO and the chair of the audit committee. My heart raced as I took a seat across from them, expecting. "What? A termination? A legal warning?" "Mark," the CEO began. "First, I want to thank you for your courage in bringing this situation to light. Your actions have saved this company from what could have been a catastrophic legal and financial outcome if the fraud had continued." I nodded, still bracing for the "but" that I was sure would follow. The board has appointed an interim management team for finance while we conduct a thorough review of our controls and procedures, he continued. As part of that process, we've been assessing which members of the team were complicit, which were merely negligent in their oversight, and which demonstrated the kind of integrity we need to rebuild this department. The audit committee chair, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, leaned forward. Your documentation was exemplary, not just in exposing the fraud, but in demonstrating a methodical, ethical approach to financial analysis. That's exactly what this company needs right now. Michael Grayson slid a folder across the table to me. We'd like to offer you the position of Interim Director of Financial Compliance, reporting directly to me. It would involve helping us clean up this mess and implementing new controls to prevent anything like this from happening again. I stared at them, momentarily speechless. This was not the outcome I had expected. Take some time to think about it, the CEO added. We understand if you'd prefer a fresh start elsewhere after what you've been through. But I didn't need time. Despite everything, I still believed in the core work Meridian was doing. Their medications helped millions of people. The company itself wasn't corrupt, just some of its leaders. I accept, I said firmly. I want to help fix this. In the year since then, things have changed dramatically at Meridian. 5 former executives, including Sarah and Ryan, are awaiting trial on multiple federal charges. The company has implemented extensive new financial controls and brought in outside experts to reshape our corporate governance. We've restated 3 years of financial results and taken a painful but necessary hit to our stock price and reputation. As for me, my interim role became permanent 6 months ago. I now lead a team of 15 financial analysts whose explicit mandate is to ensure transparency and accuracy in all our reporting. The culture is changing, slowly but surely, with a new emphasis on ethical conduct over short-term results. Last week, I was asked to speak to the newest cohort of financial analysts during their orientation. Looking out at their eager, slightly nervous faces, I thought about my own journey and what I wished someone had told me at the start. Your technical skills matter, I told them. Your financial acumen matters. But above all, your integrity matters. Because at the end of the day, numbers tell a story, and that story should be true. I sometimes think about Sarah and wonder how someone so talented could have gone so wrong. Was it greed? Ambition? Or had she simply been corrupted by a system that rewarded short-term results over honest accounting? I'll probably never know. What I do know is that the hardest decision of my professional life, choosing truth over security, risking my career to do what was right, turned out to be the best decision I ever made. Not just for my conscience, but ironically, for my career as well. The golden child system that Sarah created ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own deception. And from its ruins emerged something better, a culture built on transparency rather than favoritism, on accuracy rather than expedience. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is tell the truth especially when it isn't convenient or comfortable. The cost of silence is ultimately far greater than the price of speaking up. The END. If you like the story, subscribe to our channel and share your impressions in the comments. We try to post new stories every day.